Hello and welcome to Soteriology 101 Live. You can see as I have a guest with me this morning, Michael Patton. Welcome to the broadcast.
Hey, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Well, you've got one of those cool radio voices and you got the right equipment because you do broadcasting. Many of you may remember that we've done some responses to Credo House Ministries with, I think, Brother Sam Storms is up there in Oklahoma and up in the northern states from here in Texas. And so we appreciate you signing on. And I've said many times in my responses to you, Michael, is that I've always appreciated how cordial and ironic you guys are with regard to those who disagree with you soteriologically. And you really do set a good example for how we can have conversations with those who disagree with us. In fact, I have quoted from your article quite regularly in response to some other Calvinists who may not be quite so kind with regard to calling Calvinism the gospel. And you have an article that really addresses that. Do you want to speak on that at all or say anything about that?
Well, sure. I mean, it is. It's with every issue people get passionate about and it gets elevated. But this thing really has a lot of particular fire to it for a lot of people, and especially a lot of my those people that are on my side. It's very difficult to be associated with Calvinism sometimes because of the reputation that is out there about Calvinists. And I understand. I mean, I think I wrote an article that was called "Why I'm Not Happy to Be a Calvinist" or something like that, or "Calvinists Make the Worst Calvinists." That was it. And in that, it's the same idea. It's just everybody within Calvinism normally has this attitude about them as if they have got some type of secret piece of the information, and you feel very Gnostic at sometimes where you're like, is this what we are? Is this do we have some secret information that really requires us to beat down other people or to feel elevated in some way? And that is the way it comes across. And I know none of them would say that, but that's just the way it ends up coming across. It's belittling. And I feel belittled as a Christian whenever Calvinists belittle anybody who disagrees with them on anything. I mean, my best friends, I say this often, my best friends are Arminians mainly because I can't be around my Calvinist friends. I mean, that's all they want to talk about. And I mean, not all of them. No, I do have some good ones and we'll talk about it, I'm sure. But
well, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on, Michael, is that sometimes I end up engaging with the squeaky wheel gets the oil kind of thing, and sometimes I end up engaging on my broadcast with those who are a little louder in the Calvinistic realm of things.
Yeah.
But I've made a really special effort to get men like Chris Date and J.D. Martin, and I know I'm Eli Ayala, all of these guys, very cordial kind of Calvinists. Bing Yong, that I
is Chris Date the guy that does annihilationism?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
I was on his show not very long ago.
He's also a Calvinistic brother and very kind. I consider him a good friend. And I've tried to get more and more ironic kinds of Calvinists on the program to help counterbalance some of the others, because I don't want to build into the people who follow this broadcast an animosity and anger towards demonizing all our Calvinistic friends. I want you to see that Michael Patton probably represents more of the swath of Calvinism that I was familiar with when I was a Calvinist. Men like John Piper, who also has a broadcast on Why Are Calvinists So Mean? You can look it up, and he explains from his perspective why he thinks that's happening. And John Piper, I've had the pleasure of working with, is one of the most kind, humble, tenderhearted men I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And I've heard the same about Sam Storms, so I've never had the pleasure of working personally with Dr. Storms. But everybody that I know from the Desiring God ministries and the things that they do have always been very Christ-like in their attitude towards those who disagree with them. That doesn't mean, however, and I think, Michael, you'll agree with me on this. If you don't, please say so. I don't think that means you can't stand firmly on what you believe soteriologically. In other words, I don't think there's anything wrong with making a firm argument from the scriptures for why you believe what you believe. It's just that maturity, Christian maturity, requires for us to be able to disagree with people that we live and reside with. I mean, if any of you are married, you know that maturity in a relationship requires for you to be able to disagree with your spouse without necessarily splitting ways or without being able to be respectful to one another.
Yeah. Well, in some sense, I think that, and I'm not saying this is for all of the Calvinists out there or anybody who disagrees with somebody else, but it seems to come across as a type of insecurity. Anytime people do this, either in life or in theology, there's a insecurity that is built up, and then you kind of in that insecurity, you're unable to interact with other people because you're fearful. You're fearful that once you get around them, that they may influence you or they may cause you to doubt in some sense. And so that's what we do is we congregate. Churches congregate, people congregate, theology congregates, and everybody congregates with people that already agree with them in order just to feel more secure. And, if Paul says, when he's talking to the Corinthians, I delivered to you that which is of first importance, there's things of second importance, of third importance, and of fourth importance, and so on. And that is something that if you start your conversation with Calvinism, if you start your conversation with, what do you believe about, the 5 points or predestination, I think you're really missing the ability to have that fellowship, because it seems as if that is, the T-shirt you're wearing all the time, and people either won't want to interact with you or they may love you. I mean, and you get that love, let's high five. We're Calvinist. You're never high fiving that you're Christian. It's so. Yeah. But I do agree. It is something that is difficult to balance, because you do want to have a passion. I am passionate about what I believe on these things. I may be wrong, but I'm passionate about it, at least right now. There's been things in the past I've been passionate about that I've come to the conclusion, hey, I was wrong about that. So it gives me a little bit of tenacity or a little bit of tenderness whenever I'm dealing with these issues now.
Well, I think you make a good point about the insecurity issue. I see this sometimes in the apologetic world as the director of evangelism and apologetics.
Yeah.
I am around apologists a lot, or those who do apologetics a lot. And what I've noticed about those who are more mature in their relationship with the Father, like Ravi Zacharias, for example, and watching his work in apologetics, is he never seems real threatened or angry by atheistic comments. He always seems very calm, cool, collected, because I think he's very secure in what he believes. You see this with William Lane Craig and others as well, those who've been around a while in the apologetic world. The ones that concern me are the ones who really, because of maybe that underlying insecurity, when confronted with the claims of atheists and others, have a kind of a real visceral kind of response to being challenged in their beliefs, and that may be due to their own doubts and insecurities, because the only way you know how to deal with being pressured on your faith is to react in kind of a vehement, mean way, and that can happen in the soteriological debates as well, where both sides are reacting to the anger that's expressed by the other side, and again, this is a two-way road, because I see it among those on my page and other places that are not reacting in the way that I would like for our side, so to speak, to be represented.
Exactly what you're doing, Leighton. I mean, you have me on for this very purpose. I'm sure you're talking about having other Calvinists on, and you're thinking of your audience. I mean, that in itself starts off with, hey, Leighton is incredibly secure, not just in your Arminianism. It just seems like you're secure. You must be secure in your faith in order to let yourself be challenged in such a way, but at the same time, not congregate. Make sure other people aren't congregating, because this is just not what we do as Christians. You have people of different views, and you have people of different views, not to beat them up or eventually beat them up, but just to discuss, this kind of stuff. So it's great.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about our soteriological differences. It's one thing to say that, hey, it's fine to get along while disagreeing with each other, but let's talk about some of our points of disagreement. Let me ask maybe some questions, and then you can turn around and ask me questions if you'd like. But sure. What is there like one major theme of Calvinism that I would say, I think both of us would say we believe it because we believe the Bible teaches what we believe. I mean, that's the foundation for what we hold to. I know the the traditional way of thinking of traditionalists is that we're holding to it because of a tradition, or that we're holding to it because of emotive reasons that Calvinism just seems too mean for us, and therefore we're holding it for those reasons. And that may be true for some people. I think there's probably some people who reject Calvinism for purely emotive reasons. It's not the reason that I've rejected it, because I'm not really an emotive person. Probably need to be more emotional, but I'm not. I've rejected it for exegetical reasons. I've been convinced through the scriptures, and I'm sure you're convinced otherwise through the scriptures too. But if there was one thing that really convinces you that the heart of Calvinism is true, the kind of the idea concept that God is the one who has selected before the foundation of the world, who he's going to show his effectual grace to, and who he's going to pass by. What is that? What is that? Maybe that one strong thing that you would go, this is what really convinces me, Leighton. This is what really seals the deal for me, and why I continue to defend this particular perspective of Christianity.
Well, let's see here. I mean, there's a work of theology, and that's what I've taught the majority of my career in ministry is theology. Whenever I think of theology, I think of so many different pieces to this puzzle. And, Scripture is the biggest one for sure. And as long as Scripture speaks clearly about something, that's where I go to. But, you've got everything. You've got, the Wesleyan quadrilateral here that we're talking about. I actually have two more besides his. Or really one more, but it's I can't have two more. But I split up emotion and experience. I have, you've got the Bible is the most important thing. Then you've got reason, and then you've got church history or tradition, and then you've got the experience and emotion that are behind them as well. And there's a lot of things in each one of these that I say, well, in this area, I'm real strong. And this area, I'm not so strong, and so on. But some of my experiences that I have gone through, and to start off talking about experience, probably people wouldn't be so happy with me here. But there is a lot of things in my experience that I've had that I've been able to lean back. Not so much on my Calvinism, because anybody can really believe the way I do on this, but it's mostly on the Calvinistic side that is there. I had a girlfriend of mine that was, or not a girlfriend, but whenever I was younger, she was a girlfriend. And then like 6 months later, she was found dead and shot 6 times. And it's just terrible. They still haven't solved it. And this was whenever I was about 21 or 22 years old. And it was right after I'd become a Calvinist. And I was at her funeral, and there was somebody there, and they were saying, this was not God's will. This was not God's will. God did not want this to happen. That really scared me for him to say that. And I was like, well, if things like this are not happening, and God's up there, and I pictured this, and I know this is not the way it is. God's up there wringing his hands, hoping things will change. Then what is God doing? And I know some people could think of it just the opposite, but I thought of it this way. I need God to be in control of that. And that was one of the things that whenever Calvinism was a part of my life, especially many years later, whenever my sister killed herself, to ask the same question about that. And I found a lot of comfort in knowing that God was in control. And I'm not saying I'm not a meticulous type guy. I don't know where I stand on this control spectrum. I really don't. I mean, I think you've got the meticulous sovereignty, and you've got on the other side, maybe just a general oversight. And I know all of us fall somewhere in between. Some people are very strong, meticulous sovereignty guys like John Frame, who, it's just, everything is exactly moving because God is moving it in that direction. And I don't know if I go that far, but I do go far enough to say that in my life, whenever I look at the scriptures and then compare it to my life and say, here's what the Bible says, that God is almighty. He's not kind of mighty or sort of mighty. Then I think, wow, this fits a lot better for me emotively. And I meant that because we're all going to have so much of our emotion involved in it, whether we know it or not, whenever we're deciding these things. And whenever it came to my sister's death, I thought, do I want him to be, up there oversight and saying, I did not want this to happen. Michael, you could have saved her a second time. You should have been here. All that, or feeling sorry for us all, saying, gosh, I wish this had turned up differently, but let me work my plan out in spite of this. That kind of stuff. That stuff is not the primary reason I'm a Calvinist, but I think it's whenever you say, are you passionate about your Calvinism? That's the reason why I would say I continue to be passionate. I continue to preach it. I mean, for goodness sakes, I've preached for the last 10 years at a Church of Christ. There's not a Calvinist there, and they always make fun of me. And it's a lot of fun with those guys. They're my favorite people.
I'm wondering if, you kind of made the caveat of not necessarily believing in a more of a meticulous kind of a providence perspective, which is what Piper would hold to, obviously, and some of the most known Calvinists today Calvin himself, your namesake, would hold to a very high providence perspective of meaning God decrees all things that come to pass, which means there's a causal decisiveness in his decree. In other words, the reason the murder happened, the reason the death happened is because that's what God decreed, causally determined to bring to pass. And that's where a lot of us as non-Calvinists would reject that. We would obviously believe God's in control, but not that he's necessarily controlling, all controlling. Like a boss can be in control of your department, but not necessarily micromanage every decision. And in his control, he can choose to give you a level of control. And so in our perspective, we believe that God permits people to make free choices. And in that world of free choices, there are murders and pandemics and other horrible things that happen in a fallen world, but that he is not the author of them or the instigator of those things. He is not the causal determiner of those things. And that's usually the thing we are pushing against the most, against the Calvinistic structure. And it seems to me that maybe you have altered that form of Calvinism to not be meticulous providence. Maybe you can unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not a meticulous I'm not saying I couldn't be. I'm not just real strong in this area. I just, I think there's a spectrum, and I've heard it said, and even Sam Storms talks about this, where he will say, God didn't choose the socks that you put on this morning. That wasn't an eternal decree type thing. I think I've said, I shouldn't say that. I think I've heard him say that before, but I have heard Calvinists say that. And the seminary that I went to was Dallas Theological Seminary, which was Calvinist, but it was not as strong Calvinist as some Calvinists are. I mean, it would really take the 4 points, and the last point it would change, but also it would kind of think differently about some of the rest of the structure, and would not be quite so hardcore on the sovereignty side of it. Meaning, if you believe in God's sovereignty, you have to believe that he is in control of every maverick molecule that's going on in the universe. And so with me, I fall somewhere in between, God's providential sovereignty and his meticulous sovereignty. And I do believe that he's in control. And I do believe that there isn't a maverick molecule, if you mean in that sense, that he is overseeing, watching everything, and letting things go according to the dictates of what they are in nature, but also having a plan with that. And then, as you probably believe, and I wrote an article on this, that sometimes Calvinists and Arminians are not so different here, but as you probably believe, that he will step in at times. You probably believe he steps in less than I do. You would say in major times of history, you probably believe that he will step in whenever Jesus is going to the cross, to be able to sovereignly move within the situation in order to bring that about, because it's a monumental event that really is a big turn in his road to get to where he's going. Whereas I would, be more strong and say, well, he's done it and everything, with my kids, who were my kids, who was going to be born, when they were going to be born. You probably have that too, but when they were going to be born, where I was going to meet my wife and how I was going to meet my wife, that kind of stuff. I have him, but it's just the smaller things that I'm not quite so sure what's going on with. And it could turn out that he's meticulously sovereign. It doesn't matter. It's not real important to my Calvinism, because I don't see in Scripture the necessity of that. I just see both sides so clearly in Scripture, and I do have to work in either there's going to be a tension, or I'm going to have to adjust or something. or just deny all the passages of Scripture that Arminians have. There's just so many. It's so difficult if you're being an honest Calvinist to be a Calvinist. Everybody acts like they're so secure and they know it, and it's all so easy for them. And that's where I get irritated by Calvinists. Like, there's a quick, easy answer for really, you're just looking at that wrong. You don't really understand the Scriptures rightly in this area. And that's where I'm like, okay, I think that guy's insecure deep down.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that you've kind of pointed to first, and again, you said even that it wasn't necessarily the major reason that you've accepted the Calvinistic doctrines, but it seems like the first reason that you mentioned, at least, is the security or the comfort it may give during difficult times. But it seems like it's very possible that my perspective is very similar to your perspective, even on those regards. In other words, I still believe God's sovereign; He's in control. That He's the redeemer of evil choices and bad things, not the cause of it. In other words, I don't think He's the fireman who sets the fire and then goes in and rescues so as to demonstrate His power. I think that those things are caused by other things outside of God. In other words, that God, by granting human freedom, have allowed people to be their own determiners of choices, and those determinations have consequences that are separate from God's will and quote unquote some kind of a sovereign decree. And so we would have a different way of explaining those things. But so besides that point, because it seems like we could probably come together talking a little bit longer about if I were to have a huge tragedy in my life in the way that you did, that it seems like both of us would be comforted by the same concept of understanding that God has a purpose in allowing that, at least, because we both would believe, obviously, He allowed it for a purpose, and that we're comforted in that He's the Redeemer and He can redeem even those situations. But it seems like we both reject this concept or idea that God is the decisive cause, the decreer of all things that come to pass, including the rape, murder, Holocaust, molestations, and things like that. And so it seems like we could probably come together on that particular point. So that may not be a good point of distinction between us.
Well, it is. It may be because you may have misunderstood me. It's the rape, murders, and Holocaust that caused me to need God to step in, to find meaning in those things. I mean, here's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look at this one area right here. I'm trying to avoid the big Romans chapter 9 thing, and just jump straight into that and say, oh, that's my reason. Because deep down inside, while it is a very important part of it, and it's like something that brought me to Calvinism. I mean, my mom bringing me Romans chapter 9 and actually being very angry about it because she was reading it and saying, what do you do with this, Mr. Bible scholar type thing? And I got really angry about it.
I can send you my book if you need it.
Okay, I will.
try to sell you my book. Well, and again, on those circumstances or the situations that happen, I mean, again, we believe God is involved. It just depends on the level He's involved. If He's the one who is decreed for the molestation, murder, whatever it is, in order to redeem that which He's decreed, I think there's some problem with that. But you said you don't really believe in the meticulous providence perspective or the meticulous sovereign decree perspective in that way. And so it seems like maybe on that point, we were probably closer together than maybe I would be with other Calvinists like John Piper. And so I'm just trying to say, if that's not really the point of distinction, maybe there's another point that we could focus on, like the interpretation.
Well, there's probably a really good one, another one. I mean, I once again, that's where I bring God's meticulous care in, meticulous sovereignty in, is whenever I have my sister die. That's my point I was making. He needs to be meticulously in control of that stuff. And so that's one thing. But another thing is, whenever I think about it, and I definitely wouldn't mind being converted to Arminianism if it's true. It's not that I can't do it. So I sit and think about it quite often and think about my beliefs. I am strong in my Calvinism. I don't want to sound like I'm not, but at the same time, I think about some of the things, and I think about there's really smart people on the other side, and that causes me insecurity sometimes whenever I find somebody that's very smart and they don't agree with me, and they're very calm. Whenever they're smart and mean, then I'm like, I can write you off real easy.
I don't have to
deal with that. But when you're smart and secure, you're just very secure in your and even on the Arminian side, I think the thing that would off put me is being real defensive, overly
Right.
defensive. And I'm like, okay, that's the Arminian side. That's their problem. You got defensive Arminians and mean Calvinists type thing. And
Yeah.
one of you guys, somebody who's very calm, Thomas Oden. He used to live right down the street from me, and I was tickled to death because I used to be able to talk to him. And that guy was the nicest, kindest, most gentle man I've ever come across. And he wasn't necessarily Arminian; he was more Wesleyan. But you know how it is over there in that spectrum.
Yeah.
And just to sit down with him, I'm like, man, I want to be just like Tom. Whatever I do in life, let me be like him. And so then it caused me to start to get into his stuff. I mean, he's secured in where he's at. And so whenever you have that kind of stuff, I sit and I think, why can't I be Arminian? What's my biggest problem? I guess one of the big problems that I have is I'm not saying the impossibility, but the impossibility of me to the contrary. So to the contrary of Calvinism, what is in Arminianism that feels impossible, even philosophically. And I have a big problem with free will. The true freedom, true free will, libertarian freedom. That's where I get off the boat quite often as well, because whenever I think about libertarian freedom, I think about the ability to truly do the contrary. And what does that look like in the meantime? And I know that that's one of the big mysteries usually. I mean, it's like quick answer, but it's usually one of the mysteries within Arminianism, as we've got our mysteries within Calvinism. But there's
I would actually say, I would say it's a mystery within Calvinism too when it comes to the garden, because you got Adam and Eve who chose to sin, and when you ask the question, could they have done otherwise? Most Calvinists will say, yeah, they could have resisted because they didn't have a fallen nature. They didn't have to sin. And therefore you kind of punt the mystery down to the garden, but you're still willing to accept basically the same mystery that we accept, which is that the freedom of choice is a self-determined choice. And this is where you get into source libertarianism, which is not just PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities. It's about where's the source of the determination. If the source of the determination is in God, i.e. God determined what I will determine to do with Jesus, versus Leighton determined what he will do with Jesus, then that's the difference between Calvinism and what I call provisionism. I don't call myself an Arminian, but I understand what you mean by calling me an Arminian. But the difference in our perspective is not just the principle of alternative possibilities, the ability to do otherwise, because some people kind of play it like, okay, if it was like the DVR and you rewounded life and you replayed a choice over and over and over again, and everything was exactly the same except the person could make the choice, and it's just kind of a random as to which way it goes. I don't think any libertarian would argue that the person would choose to do otherwise if just rewound tape like that. What I think the argument is more regarding is the source of the determination. Is God determining what I will determine, or is the determination within my control? In other words, are they factors within my control? And I think it is factors within each individual's control as to what they do with the revelation of God. I don't believe God determines beforehand what a person will determine in time. What do you think about that?
It's something that I think, I'm a compatibilist, and therefore I do hold to the mystery of now God giving a responsibility, and I like to use the term responsibility within our choices, and also having sovereignty over these things. Not everything, like I said, I'm not sure about, whether he can't allow me. He was like, man, I'm going to make Michael sleep in because I've got all this stuff going on afterwards. And, there's people that can get up and listen to it that can show how stupid Calvinists are or something like that.
Somebody commented on there that the delay today was sovereignly predestined. So
there you go. Definitely. But whenever it comes down to talking about the garden, my mystery is not so much in the Adam and Eve, but in Satan beforehand and whatever went on. I'm not sure, what went on beforehand or why that serpent was doing the things he was doing, how long he'd been there. There's a lot of history there, maybe that we don't know about. And so but his influence upon them is what, began to turn things. And where's the turning points, and how that first turning point get in there, because
Right.
I cannot have God to be the author of evil. I cannot. And so
Yeah.
therefore, whenever I have this, it's like, okay, do you have Satan kind of, you spin this top, and he's spinning around, and God spun the top, and it just fell a certain way because that's what tops do. And God
Right.
made it to be able to fall a certain way. And God did want it to go this way, but he wasn't really responsible. It's the top's responsibility in that point. That's very difficult. And yes, you're right. I mean, nobody has a good answer for that stuff. I mean, nobody has a good answer for, even if you hold to my position, how that first turn took place. I just have to trust this. I have to trust that God did not create evil. I mean, or just enforce evil to become, however you define evil, enforce the shedding of his righteousness. I don't know whether God caused that. I mean, I cannot have God causing that. And also at the same time, I've got to have God being the one who is in control of all of these choices, because I cannot have this idea where we've got some theory of, I don't know what free will is. What part of your brain do you go to? Is it right here? Is it over here? Where did you get destroyed? Maybe it's this little
Right.
place back here. It's probably in your frontal lobe somewhere, and it's this little person.
The way I've described it is like, and this may be an oversimplification. Well, I know it's an oversimplification. It's meant to be an oversimplification, but is just to say, well, the cause of a choice is the chooser. The cause of a determination is the determiner, and leaving it at that. And so if God creates small determiners, and I'm not trying to say we have the ability to overrule God's determinations. He can do whatever he wants. But if he has chosen to create small determiners, small choosers, then we are the cause of our own choices. And that's mysterious and beyond full comprehension, but I don't think that the Bible gives us any reason not to just believe that. I think what Calvinism does is goes beyond the pages of Scripture to say that God's determining what we will determine. And therefore, those who end up in hell ultimately had no real control over what they do with the gospel, what they do with the light of revelation, that God didn't really send Jesus to die for those people. He didn't really want them, at least secretly. He may have pretended like, or outwardly said that he wanted them, but secretly he really didn't provide the atonement for them. He really didn't send them the sufficient amount of grace they needed. And I just think that really takes away the blameworthiness of those who end up in hell, because it's ultimately saying God determined that your determination to reject him, and you really had nothing to do with it. And that seems real problematic to me.
Well, and let's go back to the impossibility of its opposite. I mean, what I'm talking about here, and move that down the line. I don't see at what point Arminianism makes things any better. Simply, or excuse me, just that spectrum over there makes things any
Right.
better.
Our side. Yeah.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
there you go.
We understand when you say Arminianism, you're including
I don't
all
know.
of the provisions as well.
Thomas
Possibly,
Oden did not like to be called Arminian. He was very
yeah.
proud.
I don't either, but I don't. I'm not an Arminian either, but I understand what you mean. So I'm fine with you.
Yeah, Jacob Arminius. I mean, you read him; he doesn't sound like an Arminian anymore either. Whenever you read him, he's a good guy.
He
I've
does
got
sound very.
I got to work somewhere back here. I should have set it up so you can look at it and say, "Hey, there they are."
Well, he came from the same camp. I mean, he was a part of Geneva, so he knew the language, and a lot of what he said did sound very, very pro-Calvinist in a lot of ways. So,
definitely.
But go ahead with your point.
But whenever you're going down the line and you're saying, okay, well, you've got so-and-so person, you got Michael Patton here in Oklahoma City. And why is he a Christian? And when you look at all the different factors, I would say, well, the reason why I'm a Christian is not first you say God came in and zapped him to be one, or one day he woke him up out of nowhere, and there was no factors beforehand that led to that waking up. There was no kind of self-realization during that. I mean, it's not as if anybody just comes from a blank slate and becomes a Christian. There's so many different things that the Spirit works into our lives. And I'm glad to be born to my mother, who taught me Christianity all my life. I don't remember a time not believing in Christ. I remember having a deep relationship with him just kind of by default. And I think it was a real relationship whenever I was 12 years old. I remember all the way back to whenever I was 4 years old. And me and my best friend Todd were swinging. This is my earliest memory,
All right.
by the way. Yeah, except for the one whenever I was Tarzan jumping out with the knife, and boy, I got in trouble for that. But but I remember swinging with my friend Todd, and I was kind of stepping back, and Todd was swinging back and forth. And I said, "Todd, do you believe in Jesus?" And he was 3, I'm 4, and he said, "No, I don't." I said, "Then you're going to hell." And he said, "Then I do." So that was my first convert. But I don't really know how genuine my faith was then. But fast forward, 6 years, whenever I'm sitting there by my bedside and I'm praying to Jesus to help me because there's certain things in my life, and I'm crying, and I think, golly, that's the same Jesus as I believe in now. So there hasn't been any problems there. And I'm like, why am I a Christian? And all these factors come in. I don't think he just zapped me out of nowhere. All these factors come in that God brings in our lives that move us along. And then I think, well, why is somebody else not a Christian? If I do believe, over there on that side, I have problems because I've got God placing him with people with other families, and just generally speaking, they're all becoming what it is that their environment has provided for them. And so I look at that and I say, well, isn't that a sense of God choosing? And then don't we end up in the same place if we admit that it is a sense of God choosing? Unless you were to believe that God zapped them and, he only wanted to. I mean, you would think there would be some type of balance. You would think that there would be just as many Christians in Iran and as there is in America, unless you want to put lots and lots of secret Christians always there and lots of hidden Christians always here.
Well, the way I'd push back on that is I think that's kind of what Romans 1 and 2 is getting into with Paul when he talks about the Gentiles. He's speaking of those who've never heard the gospel in a sense, because he's speaking about those who haven't the special revelation of the prophets. And he goes on to speak of how, obviously, and I know you're a student of the word, so you know this already. I'm not preaching at you. I'm just stating my position on this, is that in Romans 1 and 2, when he talks about the conscience or the law written on the heart, is that revelation is sufficient revelation for people to recognize God as God and to fear him. And those who fear the Lord, God reveals more truth too. We see this throughout the scriptures. Matter of fact, my interview yesterday with Louis Ruggiero, we kind of went over these passages about those who fear the Lord and they don't have the revelation of the specifics of Jesus, but they have a fear of God based upon the light of revelation they have, and that God is faithful to bring them more and more light of revelation, like he does for Cornelius and others throughout the text. And so the way we would push back on that is that God, in his grace, does show a sufficient amount of light and revelation to every one of his creatures so that they can respond to that light and revelation. And if they respond to that light and revelation with any measure of faith, then God is faithful to bring them more light, more revelation, so that they can know of Christ and thus be saved. And so that's our perspective and how we would answer that. So the way we as provisionists would say is that God provides for all people, and that all have a sufficient amount of knowledge and understanding of God, as Romans 1, I think, says, that they are without excuse, meaning that they don't have an excuse for their rejection of the light that they have. I don't know if that clarifies anything, but that's the way we would answer that just because of geography or the parents you're born to doesn't give anybody excuse for not acknowledging God as God.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I do agree with the God provides for everybody. And I do agree with that's what Romans chapter 1 is saying. But at the same time, what I would say is that whenever I'm looking at this, I'm looking at this boxing match that takes place. Two guys are 22 years old and they're in a boxing match,
Right.
And one guy comes in and he's just fit and he's strong and he's just ready and he's bouncing around and he knows how to box. He's been taught how to box and he's been fed the right foods and on the right diet. And he's watched boxers. His whole life is around that. And then another guy, he's grown up. He's lanky and he can walk, and move and maybe get his fists up. He's got enough, but he doesn't have what this guy had over there. And so he's grown up with just bread and water his whole life. He's never had a influence about boxing ever. He's never watched anybody box, doesn't even really care about boxing, to tell you the truth, but he's in the match. And you're like, who's going to win that? Well, you could say, well, they were both provided with enough to get to this point, and they both got to the boxing match. Yeah, sure. But one guy was provided with much, much more, and is, even in the Arminian view, much more likely to have become a boxer, whereas the other guy was like, how in the world this guy became a boxer? It's miraculous. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think I get what you're saying, is that a person, for example, born to a Muslim family in the middle of Iraq is a lot more in a quandary of coming to faith in the God of Scripture than a person born in Oklahoma City being raised by a faithful father and mother who take them to church every week. And you see the distinction between those two environments. And I acknowledge that distinction. I think that this person, like the examples of Tyre and Sidon and Bethsaida, Jesus says if they would have seen these signs and wonders, they would have repented long ago, which seems to indicate that there was freedom of the will involved, at least in those cities. Then I would just push back and just say,
but it also implies some sort of choice. Why weren't they given this much?
Well, because they were. My answer would be Romans 1 and 2. They were given conscience. They were given sufficient grace.
But he says,
and they rejected
if they were given what you were given, you've been given all the meat and food and boxers and trainers. If they had been given all this stuff, they would have repented.
And why would they do that without effectual regeneration?
Yeah, well,
in other words, they need effectual regeneration in order to believe on Calvinism. And so why would he reference signs and wonders as possibly convincing
But what I'm saying there is it doesn't help your position anymore, that particular text. I realize the difficulty for my position, but your position isn't more well off. I mean, it gets pummeled there as well.
Well, my position is that God doesn't owe more signs and wonders to those who reject the light of revelation they've been given. So we would have an answer to that, to say
but
that
he says if they would have changed. Jesus, it was right. Jesus just and so assuming maybe
it's God's sovereign prerogative to bring the light of revelation that's sufficient, but he doesn't have to continue to strive with men just because it might convince them if he continues to strive with them. He's not obligated to do that.
You're saying, of course he's not obligated, but my point is, you're saying that they were given enough, but not as much as these people. They would have changed. Therefore, here's why I end up back in the same position. I think we end up in the same position because you have no better explanation for why people are becoming believers or not becoming believers unless you have some type of sovereignty built in.
Well, I agree that there is a problem with that issue, because then you go, okay, why didn't God just do more signs and wonders and therefore convince them to believe? Well, we'd have to speculate as to the reasons for doing so. Maybe he doesn't want people to believe based upon signs and wonders because that's a mark of a perverse generation. As he says, it's a perverse generation that requires signs and wonders versus ones who believe through a more of a childlike, simple faith. But it doesn't answer to the kind of the U2 fallacy is what you're kind of relying upon. And in other words, I don't have to deal with the problem if I just say you have the same problem. Well, we actually have.
Well, what I'm dealing with though, is
philosophical.
Mine's philosophical right now, not so much biblical. I recognize the biblical both sides on that passage, but philosophically, he references what I'm talking about right now. Because with or without God, or with or without revelation, then I'd have to figure out what is going on. Why are people being born, in Iran? Why are they the mass majority of them not Christian? And then we have a lot higher percentage in places that have a biblical background. Why is it important to bring up your children in faith? Well, because that's important, because we want them to become Christians. We want them to come back to the faith. We want them to be convinced of it. Well, that we've got great advantages here because we've got all the skills of a boxer set up in our life beforehand, and they had nothing.
Well, and what I'm trying to point out is that when you asked the question, I was able to give a response, and my response was to say that God's not obligated to give more light, more revelation. He may not want to give more light, more revelation, because he may not want people to be basing a belief or trust in him on signs and wonders. But then to turn around and just say, okay, from your perspective, why are signs and wonders even being considered if effectual regeneration is at work? In other words, if God chooses people unconditionally before the world began, what does it matter if they're born in Iraq or not? What does it matter if they're signs and wonders or not? It's just a matter of whether he's effectually chosen somebody and gives them the effectual grace. The location they're born in, the signs and wonders really play no part whatsoever in whether somebody believes.
I wouldn't say that at all. I would say that God delights in the methodology that he chooses. So then, going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, he not only chooses the ends, he also chooses the means to get there. And he delights in these means, whatever those means are. And that he delights in having a great family. He delights in having scripture that is translated into your language. He delights in having examples in your life that you grab a hold of and are heroic to you, and that mold you. And I think that's all true molding that goes on in the process. And, so therefore you have this delight of God to have a methodology that he uses. And if there wasn't a consistent methodology, we wouldn't be explained how to do this in scripture, how to parent, how to be a good example, how to lead others to faith or to the light, and how joyful that is whenever you do so. So he does have a methodology. He does have delight in that methodology, but in some places it's just not there. It's not present at all.
Well, I would push back just by saying we agree that there are means involved, but we actually believe the means mean something, in that the means actually can affect the person's response.
But I believe the means mean something too. I mean, if that is the means that God uses, then of course they're more meaningful. I mean, this is God's movements. How meaningful are God's movements?
Well, and what I'm trying to get at is that they mean something in that they have effect. For example, if you have, let's say you have a person in Iraq, two people in Iraq and two people in Oklahoma City. Okay. One of the people in Oklahoma City come to know Jesus, but one of them reject Jesus. And you have the two people in Iraq, same kind of thing. One of them accepts Jesus, one of them rejects Jesus. It's not their surroundings that have determined this, obviously. It's whether God has effectually chosen them, if Calvinism is true, and has effectually graced them. The means don't mean anything, really, when it comes down to the reason that one of them chose and one of them different. Same thing with the Tyre and Sidon and Bethsaida conversation we were having earlier. It doesn't matter how many signs or wonders somebody does in front of somebody in any given situation, because on Calvinism, it's whether they've been regenerated or not, as to whether they're going to believe or not. And so that all those means are superfluous as to the ultimate cause of why someone comes to faith and why someone doesn't. That's what I'm trying to get to.
Saying, they're superfluous only to the degree that what level you're looking at it in the microscope. I mean, yes, you've got ultimately in the end, if God chose you, that is the ultimate ends. But they're not superfluous, because that's exactly the way God brings about his business. It's this divine command within circumstances where these are the things that are going to be brought about, how they're going to be brought about. Everything matters. Everything has mattered from day one, whenever creation started, and every turning point that everybody has made, those have mattered. They're not superfluous. They are the means by which God brings this about. Yes, could he have done something different? Maybe, but this is the way he chose it, and this is exactly how it got pulled off. And that's the reason why you have Jesus saying, if those things would have happened in that city, then they would have repented. It's so important, because you're saying he didn't allow for those means. Not everybody has the same chance. Not everybody has the same chance to win that boxing match.
Yeah. And again, the means, talking about the means, this is where Paul talks about this. And he says he made from one man from every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and their boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. And so it does seem, he does seem to be pointing to the fact that people do live in every part of the earth, and he's appointed for their times and the boundaries of their habitation where they live. But he does this not for the purpose of effectually saving some and damning others, but he seems to say he does this so that they all may seek him and perhaps even find him, though he's not far from either one of us,
Well,
which seems to
so
be
are you
more
saying,
in our line than in your line of thought.
are you saying that everybody has the same chance of being saved? Is that your belief?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, everybody has the same chance. I mean,
Chance. It depends on what you mean by
a
chance.
50-50 chance if you're flipping a coin. If you're flipping a
Sorry.
coin in Iraq, it's going to be the same thing as flipping a coin here. And so you've got the coins being flipped, and for some reason, everybody with the same chance, they're all getting tails, because heads, I like heads better. That's what I always call. They're all getting tails for the most part. We're getting a lot more heads over here. Is that just chance? Or is there something that is divinely built in? And that Acts chapter 17 would be where I would go to. I would say Acts chapter 17 says that it has been built in. It has been built by God.
Well, this is where I would say free will is at play with the influences of external factors. And so if you have a free will that's being influenced by external factors, then obviously you're going to have groups of people who come to faith in areas where light and revelation, God's grace, is being made manifest. Because obviously, if you raise a child in the way they should go, guess what? They tend to go that way. But if you raise a child in another way, they tend not to go that way, because that's the effects of free will. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a sufficient amount of grace by which they can still acknowledge and respond to God.
They have bread and water. They have bread and water.
Right. Well, not only that, but they have sufficient revelation of who God is, so that they may recognize him as God.
For the boxing match, they have bread and water to get to the boxing match. They've enough. They've been, they're alive, and they're crawling in onto this stage, and they're barely able to move and to stand up, but they're alive. They're sufficient enough. That's the idea here. Yes.
It seems like you're kind of putting it to where the unbeliever has to work to believe in God, like fight the match to believe in God. And I think, I don't believe in works salvation, but I do believe in works damnation. And what I mean by that, I think it's a work to suppress the truth of who God is. I think God makes himself so abundantly clear through revelation, through both your conscience, which Romans 2 says, the law is written on our hearts, and that the Gentiles who by nature follow the law are demonstrating that this is truth. And so when people do the right thing who don't even know the scriptures, they are demonstrating that God has revealed himself to them to a degree that they can know the difference between right and wrong. And so my point is just to say is that that they're having to suppress. The word suppress there is an active word of work. You are, and you've seen this. I know you've debated with people, and you've done things with agnostics and atheists and stuff. Man, they are working their butts off to explain away God. They are doing everything they can to explain away who God is and how he works, because it takes a lot of work to explain away what seems so obvious all around us in creation. And so it seems like to me, you're kind of putting it on the opposite way, that the man has to work or box or fight his way into faith, when the truth is you really have to, in my opinion, work to suppress the obvious truth of what's being made known right in front of us.
Well, maybe at that point, the boxer illustration breaks down. I'm just saying this guy had less of a chance, through the natural means, to be where he was at. But that's okay.
It depends on what you mean by chance, too, I guess, because
if you're giving everybody an even chance, everybody's got an even chance.
Opportunity? Are you saying opportunities? Yeah.
Or chance, whatever it is. It's I'm not saying, chance actually exists, but the way we use chance. And so out there, if you're trying to say everybody should have equal abilities, equal opportunity, equal chance, and you're not saying, well, some people do have bigger chance than others. Those are the ones that are saved. Well, listen, let me tell you something that is my weakest point, because I like to always tell this. Within Calvinism, and that you may say, no, that's not your weakest point. There's lots of other weaker points, but my weakest point, whenever I think about Calvinism, or you say, what keeps you up at night about Calvinism, scratching your head more than anything else? You've probably heard this before. You may have pushed back against this with somebody before, but I do acknowledge this difficulty, and it's a significant difficulty. And it's, if God loves everybody, which I do believe he does, why isn't everybody ultimately chosen? And that's the biggest thing. just to beat me down with. If you wanted to have me cower in a corner right now, that's where I'd be, in a corner, if you started with that, because I don't know the answer to that. And I often tell people, the only thing I can tell you is that's the first thing that I will ask God whenever I get there, because I'm totally confounded by it, because I do seriously believe he loves everybody and really does want them to come to repentance. And any Calvinist who denies that and tries to qualify all these words, I've seen more acrobats with Calvinists in these areas than anything in my life, with the word world and, John 3:16 and such. We can do all kinds of acrobats to get around and make our position fit real nice and neat, and it looks like a puzzle. Ours isn't. Ours is messy too. Y'all's is messy. You may not think that, but y'all's is messy. Ours is messy. And who's got the bigger mess that you're willing to?
And this is why. And this is why. And this is one of the reasons that we talk about how important it is for us to go to the scriptures versus to experience and emotion, because all of us can talk about ways that the other side has difficulties, and I think only an honest theologian from both perspectives is going to say, yeah, we have our issues. That's why I was mentioning the YouTube fallacy earlier, was not to discredit your argument. I think you have it's a solid argument. It's true. It is a problem for our side. It's just that it doesn't remove the more difficult problem, in my estimation, from your side. And so while I'll present an answer for my side of the debate, I'm not going to allow my opponent, quote unquote, and the ironic sense of the word, obviously, to say, well, I don't have to give an answer from my perspective. And so, that's the point I was trying to point out on. But you mentioned Romans chapter 9 earlier. I'm curious. I'm always curious with this, because this happens to be what my dissertation was on, and the book that I wrote, The Potter's Promise, is really focusing obviously on Romans 9 and the exegesis of it. And so I'm always curious from my Calvinistic friends as to what they think we think Romans 9 teaches, because it's really interesting to me that very few Calvinists, in my experience, now that's obviously limited, very few Calvinists that I engage with online really understand how we interpret Romans 9. I was a Calvinist for 10 years, so I get the basic flow of how most Calvinists, though there are different takes even among Calvinists on how they take Romans 9, depending on who you're reading. I do, and I think I can give a pretty fair estimation as to how a Calvinist would read Romans 9. But I'm just curious how you might think we read Romans 9. For example, when it says God can have mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, he can have compassion on whom he wants to have compassion. What do you think we believe Paul is meaning, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. And I guess if you would ask me this whenever I first became a Calvinist, I'd be like, well, it's all easy. All they do is they take these passages and they rework them to where, some sense of it has the foundation of some sense of God looking ahead in the future and deciding who's going to believe, and then chooses them based upon that. And we got them, boom, slam. But and that is a position that people start with. But ever since I've began to really study Romans chapter 9 and look for the Arminian position on Romans chapter 9, I found it's very varied. I mean, different people have different. I'm sorry, not Arminian position, just the positions over there.
Yeah,
non-Calvinist.
Yeah.
The positions over there, I find them very varied, and I every time I read a new commentary, listen to a new person on this, although I don't, frankly, I don't have that many commentaries that aren't Calvinistic. It's just hard to find them. Not that's saying anything, but it is difficult to find them for me. I haven't seen too many that are that way, but whenever I do, I find different approaches by different people on that side.
Yeah.
And I've sometimes something I've never heard before, and kind of creative maybe.
Yeah. And so it does seem to me that you've kind of, and this is the same mistake that I made when I was a Calvinist, is just to assume that the foresight faith, kind of Wesleyan Arminian perspective, was really the only way to handle Romans 9, as God looks through the quarters of time and sees who's going to believe, and then that's the person he's going to have compassion on. And I don't think that's what Paul is talking about at all.
But I said I
Yeah.
used to think that about Arminians.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and you gave
Yeah.
that you're realizing there's a varied approaches. Absolutely, there are, and the more corporate perspective is the one that I tend to hold to, and the election to service is also involved within that, because obviously God does choose the nation of Israel to bring His Messiah and His message through. He chooses individuals from that nation, like the apostles and the prophets.
Or He chooses Jesus Christ as
obviously the chosen one.
Him. I thought that was the best one I've ever heard, was He chooses Jesus Christ and then all those who are found in Him. It makes a lot of sense for me.
Right.
It doesn't make a sense out of Romans chapter 9 for me, but it makes a lot of sense to see that view of predestination.
Well, and one of the things I'll mention in Romans 9, and we won't go through, I mean, we're already at our hour mark, so we won't go through a lot of it, but what I'll point out is to show somebody mercy doesn't mean to effectually save them. To show somebody mercy means to have compassion for them, or to show them patience, even though they deserve to be destroyed. In other words, it's refraining from punishing somebody who deserves to be punished. And you as a theologian, I think, know the difference between mercy and grace. Is mercy is not giving somebody what they do deserve, punishment, and grace is the abundance of heaven and all the riches that we give above and beyond that we don't deserve. Well, to say I will have mercy on whom I have mercy doesn't mean that I'm going to effectually save certain individuals and not others. For us, it means what it meant in the original context of Exodus 32 and 33, where he's pulling the quote from. And that is when Israel, who just built a golden calf, is about to be destroyed. And Moses intercedes for them and prays for them. And God relents in his desire to destroy them and decides to show them mercy. And he quotes, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. And that in that context, therefore, is God showing patience, or being long suffering for vessels who are prepared for destruction. They deserve to be destroyed for building idols. And God, instead of destroying Israel, He decides to show them mercy, i.e., to refrain from punishing them in order to make sure His promise is fulfilled to Abraham. And then I will harden whom I will harden. Again, the Calvinist reads that, at least I did when I was a Calvinist, and I thought, well, that means to reprobate or to damn somebody who He wants to damn, and it's His prerogative. If He wants to choose to pass over people before the foundation of the world, who are you to question Him? And that's the way I thought of, He'll harden whom He wants to harden. But I think it's actually saying Israel, he can show them patience when He wants to show them patience. In other words, mercy them. And He can harden them when He wants to harden them, meaning not to effectually damn them to hell, but that I can give them a spirit of stupor, or I can blind them in their rebellion so as to accomplish the Passover and the ingrafting of the Gentiles. In other words, I will have mercy who I want to mercy, and I will harden who I want to harden, is in reference to Israel as a whole, in the times that He has mercied them when it served His purpose to fulfill His promise through mercying them, and He's hardening them when it serves His purpose to harden them to bring about redemption for the nations. And that these hardened ones, these ones who are cut off for their unbelief, He actually holds out hope for them, Michael, because it says they've stumbled but not beyond recovery, and that they might be provoked to envy, and that they too might be saved. And so, in other words, these hardened individuals in Romans 9 are the same ones He thinks might be grafted back in if they will leave their unbelief and come back and believe in God. And so, from my perspective, I don't believe Romans 9, 10, and 11 has anything to do with individuals being effectually damned or effectually saved. It has to do with the nation of Israel being shown mercy at times in order to glorify God in His promise, to fulfill His promise, and harden Israel at times, though stumbling not beyond recovery, in order to bring about His purpose of redemption through them. And though that's a little bit weighty and deep, and it takes a little bit of unpacking to go back through the 13 different Old Testament passages that Paul is pulling into Romans 9, it takes a little bit of time to walk through that. I think when most Calvinists at least walk through it with us to understand where we're tracking Paul, they often, in my experience, have walked away going, oh, okay, well, I didn't even consider that. I only considered the foresight faith perspective, and or this, what I used to think was the corporate perspective was, oh, well, if it's true of corporations, it must be true of individuals. And I would just dismiss the corporate view out of hand as a Calvinist, because I just thought, well, that's just more people. If God's damning Esau, then that's just damning more people. And so you don't really get away from the problem. And that's, from our perspective, not at all what Paul is trying to contrast by pointing out Jacob and Esau. And so the only reason I point all that out is just to say that for every one of these texts that a Calvinist will bring that they think teaches individuals being selected before the foundation of the world for salvation or damnation, I think there's an alternative and a much more robust, better interpretation that doesn't leave the quandary of Calvinism and the angst that Calvinism creates within a lot of us to think that God just arbitrarily picks some and damns others.
Mm. Yeah, I like it. I like your interpretation. It's very nice. It's different in some ways. It's nuanced in some ways. It kind of goes back to the same thing with me. Every time I hear now an Arminian or read an Arminian, it's a little bit different interpretation, and sometimes completely different. It's all over there. And I wonder. I'm sitting there thinking.
And to be fair, before you say your next thing, to be fair, between Moo, Morris, White. I mean, and I can name about 5 or 6 others that I cite in my book. They have different interpretations too, and so even among Calvinists, there's different.
You can't say that it's to the degree that it is among Arminians.
Probably not in their common proof text, but in other proof texts like 1 Timothy 2:4 or 2 Peter 3:9.
Well, in the problem passages, really, there's
right.
more
and so
united.
when you have a common text that we like John 3:16, most Arminians are very monolithic in their way of approaching that possibly. But in their problem passages, i.e. the difficult ones like Romans 9, you're going to have more nuances than with the Calvinists possibly.
Right. I mean, it is a difficult passage.
There's distinctly 3 different takes on Romans 9 among scholarly Calvinists, just so you're aware of that. They're very distinct, 3 very distinct interpretations of Romans 9.
I've read a lot of them, and I don't necessarily think they're that distinct, but here's what I was thinking.
They're maybe less distinct than our differences among our folks.
Maybe so.
Okay.
But I'm sitting there thinking, did God intend for this passage to be so controversial and lead Calvinists to be Calvinists, or is that a byproduct of him not being quite so controlling of Paul at this point to be more precise? I mean, and I do that not to laugh at either side. I do that because as we sit here and we wrestle with these things, what a glorious thing it is in the differences that we weren't given this book that said, here's how to interpret everything. Here's the book, and by the way, here's the book how to interpret everything. That he loves the wrestling match. He loves what's going on right here, because it either way it causes us to dig deeper, to think deeper, to wrestle with God. I mean, when I first heard about Calvinism, before I became a Calvinist, I was in a 6-month wrestling match with God. I was like, things the way I can't take my, but did he intend for that? And I have to say, both of us can agree, this is a great thing for our faith. This kind of wrestling match, to deeply understand it, because you believe what you believe about these things more deeply because you've wrestled with them for so long. I believe what I believe because I've wrestled with them for so long. I think that the greatest thing that we could do next is prioritize and see where it puts these things. One of us is going to be wrong, or both of us are going to be wrong. And I'm not sure who it is. You're probably going to end up being right, and I'll be fine with that. I actually will. So,
well, good, because you're going to have to get used to it. No, I'm just joking. Obviously, if I'm wrong, it's because God's decreed it, I guess. But nevertheless,
hey, there you go.
Well, and that's the thing is you mentioned about, okay, was God in control of Romans 9 being written, and all those kinds of things, and I would say yes. And my explanation as to the different interpretations and the angst or the debates that have been created, or church splits that have been created over the issue, is due to free will. I mean, that's what free will is all about, is the ability to interpret things differently and to come to different conclusions and to argue it. Now, on Calvinism, at least the higher forms of Calvinism, like John Piper might hold to, all of the debates and disagreements over Calvinism are just as much as decreed as the molestations and rapes and murders and Holocaust and all the other things that are decreed by God. And therefore, it leaves you kind of wondering why he has granted some of his children this ability to understand Romans 9 correctly, and the rest of us, he has decreed for us just not to get it right. And so I think there's more problems with the Calvinists.
It's just Michael have I loved, Leighton have I hated. You just put those words in there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the way you end up, is that Michael is a little bit more loved in his election. He's elect and Leighton's elect because most
Believe
people,
me, I'm not the more loved out of the two. If you only knew me.
well, I think that's why you're so easy to get along with, is because there is obviously the fruits of the Spirit and humility in your life. We do have one question that came in, and thanks for the donation there to Soteriology 101. He says, all of our salvation is of God, whose arms would all embrace, whose perish self-destroyed for not accepting grace. Charles Wesley. Are those self-destroyed on Calvinism given God's choice to destroy?
Okay, let me look at the passage again, or the quote.
No, he's quoting from Charles Wesley, and he's making the point: are those who are destroyed given a choice? In other words, those end up in hell? Did they really have a choice? I guess is maybe what he's asking.
I think they did. I mean, I think people are in hell, freely. I think that they love to be in hell rather than to be with God. I mean, God leaves them in their choice. I don't know why he doesn't change them like he changes us, but I do believe that that's their choice.
When we say choice defined by Webster is the selection between available options. Is it really an available option for a reprobate who Christ did not die for?
Well, yeah, that's why the books are open. I mean, he has an option of how much he's going to rebel against God. There's going to be some people that don't rebel against God quite as much, and the books will be open, and there's going to be some level of hell for them that's better off than another one. So, yeah, there's lots of choices that are there that are available for them, and so they choose according to that. Now, if you're saying,
but not the choice to accept Christ.
Well, theoretically, yes, they have the choice to accept Christ. They have the ability to accept Christ, but it's not going to cross their mind.
But Christ didn't die for them, or he did? I'm not sure where you stand on the L.
I don't either. Don't even get into that. I haven't even thought about it yet today. So
all right, I won't press you on it. We're past our hour mark, and I told you I'd keep you for an hour.
Hey, it was
Michael,
fun.
You're welcome.
It was fun.
You're welcome to stay longer, and I can talk theology with you all day long. But I don't. I know you have a family there. I've got a family here. I've seen one walk by the door 4 times, looking whether I'm going to be done or not here. So. And so I will let us go for now, but I'd love to.
It's nice whenever we're in confinement like this to have somebody to discuss theology with, even if you disagree. I know you seem to be a really good guy.
Well, can you imagine going through this kind of pandemic back before internet or even before television or something of that nature, being locked in the house? There's so many means of connection that we still have today that we would not
just having nothing. Having nothing.
It would be crazy. But Michael, God bless you. And thank you for serving the Lord. Thank you for your kind demeanor and showing that we can disagree with one another and still love each other, still pray for one another, still be in fellowship with one another. Thank you for that. Thank you for being a model.
Back at you. Thank you for having me on. That shows a lot.